Modern industrial technology, the unique achievement of our age, unmatched in Earth's long history. But maybe not. Today, a growing band of scientists and researchers have begun to wonder aloud if advanced technology could possibly have existed on Earth thousands of years ago. Impossible, scoff the experts. Only in the last few generations, they say, has humanity learned to harness the forces of nature, and only in recent decades developed what we now proudly call high technology. History and the evidence, they assert, is clear on the point. But is it really? Today's state-of-the-art tests and cutting-edge research facilities and modern engineering laboratories have begun to confirm the incredible, the existence in Earth's ancient past of what can only be called space-age technology. Could it be that at a time when our ancestors are credited with being little more than hunter-gatherers, high-tech engineering methods equal to, if not superior to, our own were being applied on a worldwide basis? Could today's scientists and academics actually learn something from their ancient forebears?
Hi, I'm Doug Kenyon, editor and publisher of Atlantis Rising magazine. This is Stonehenge in southern England, one of thousands of mysterious megalithic sites around the world built by ancient engineers using methods which remain a mystery today. While it's true that many attempts have been made to explain how primitive cultures could have moved, placed, and aligned such giant blocks of stone with a skill and precision which we would be at pains to duplicate today, the fact is that nobody knows for sure how it was done. Today, astonishing new evidence is emerging to show that the ancient builders were far more sophisticated than has previously been supposed. In fact, there are some, including, for example, many top government defense scientists, who have employed advanced mathematics and engineering tools to demonstrate achievements in ancient technology which our own science has yet to equal. For the next hour, we'll look at startling new answers to many troubling and persistent ancient riddles. So keep your mind open and your reason clear, and join me now as Atlantis Rising presents The Technologies of the Gods.
Anybody with any degree of expertise in astronomy or in building or in architecture looks at the pyramids, the Sphinx temples, various of these other structures built out of, with cyclopean-sized blocks, and realizes that this could not have been done, as the archaeologists themselves, insist, by slaves with ramps and no pulleys but ropes, pulling these 70 and 80 and 100 and 200 ton blocks into place up mud ramps. So we're confronted by a technology, clearly a technology that we absolutely don't understand. One of the reasons why it is so difficult to approach Egypt, because their way of going about their lives was so very different from our own, that if you can't begin to experience on that level, and usually that experience comes out of a sensitivity to great works of art. If you don't have that sensitivity, Egypt remains to you forever opaque.
In 1994, author and Egyptologist John Anthony West won an Emmy Award for research on the NBC television special The Mystery of the Sphinx. West and Boston University geologist Dr. Robert Schoch had jolted the orthodox academic establishment with powerful geological evidence that the Great Sphinx of Egypt was thousands of years older than has been taught. West believes that not only was ancient civilization on Earth much older, it was also much wiser than Orthodox scholarship has maintained.
One of the problems of Egyptology and archaeology and the study of ancient civilizations in general, and that is the modern conceit shared by virtually all academics, all official academics, that we represent the apogee of civilization and that everything else that happened before us are sort of lesser breeds without the technology, as it were. When you come from my point of view, you tend to take an opposite tack, which is that for all our technological and even scientific brilliance, we don't know what the hell our lives are all about, and we should look, if we have any sense at all, before we self-destruct, to these ancient cultures for guidance, as it were, and not for comparisons, us against them.
John Anthony West is not alone in his challenge to such arguments.
Now, one of the main problems is the size of blocks involved. We're dealing with the Sphinx temple, for example, where blocks are in the region between 50 and 150 tons, some of them going much higher to 200 tons. Now, the confines of the Sphinx temple is very, very tight. So in order to move blocks in that very confined area, I cannot see how one can use the kind of primitive conditions that is traditionally allocated to the pyramid builders.
Oftentimes, archaeologists find information and evidence that shows that they're wrong, particularly that civilizations were more advanced in ancient times. The Antikythera device, which is today in the Athens Museum, is such a device. It's a highly machined computer of dozens of cogged wheels fitted together in a very precise astronomical computer. When scientists examined this in the 50s, they declared that it was tantamount to finding a jet plane in the tomb of King Tut.
We don't know how to move 200 tons. And what's more, when you get down to the question of how you build a pyramid, the Japanese found they could only do this by using giant cranes. And even then, they built a sort of tiny little pyramid. They couldn't do it. They didn't know how to do it.
When I have discussed the lifting of these stones with individuals who actually do some lifting and do it for a living, we call them riggers, they express amazement, especially when we're talking about 200-ton blocks being lifted, and also talking about the 43 granite beams that were installed above the King's Chamber in the Great Pyramid, weighing up to 70 tons each, and raised to a level of over 175 feet in the air. The technologist or the individual who would actually be doing the work express amazement that it could be done, and it's would say that it's almost an impossible task in this day and age.
This structure, more than any built example on the face of this planet, is your proof positive of a technologically advanced civilization that existed prior to the first dynastic period in ancient Egypt.
In his haunting classic science fiction novel, A Canticle for Leibowitz, author Walter M. Miller Jr. envisions a post-apocalyptic future in which a few fragments of our present civilization survive.
Hundreds of years after a nuclear holocaust, humanity has again fallen into the barbarism of a dark age. Struggling to preserve the fragile relics which remain from a more advanced, albeit forgotten era, a handful of cloistered and dedicated monks seek to stave off the looming threat of total amnesia for humanity. The brothers themselves, unfortunately, have lost most of the keys to understanding the mysterious culture which preceded an ancient deluge of fire. Their mistakes of interpretation are many. An electronic schematic diagram, for example, though incomprehensible, is seen as a thing of mystical beauty, and one consecrated monk spends a lifetime lovingly illuminating it with gold scroll work. And within the cloistered walls of the monastery, tales of the fallouts, those dreadful monsters which once devoured the ancients, are whispered about with much fear and trembling. Ages pass in Miller's story, and understanding of nature's processes once again begins to dawn. Electricity is rediscovered. Mechanical transportation developed. Even powered flight. Technology is born again. And even as in a flawed and distorted way, the knowledge of the ancients is slowly reconstructed, odd patterns of the previous order ironically reappear. A theological dogma, for example, forbids recognition of the true nature of ancient advancement, and an arrogant new order seeks, by claiming the unprecedented nature of its own achievements, to buttress its own authority. Somehow, though, as Miller tells it, despite ignorance and tyranny, civilization painfully climbs once again to the heights and finds itself at a crossroads where, like its forebears, it must confront terrible dilemmas or die. If society was to survive, Miller believed it must somehow come to understand and overcome the challenges which destroyed its predecessors.
Well, so much for science fiction. Nothing of the sort is happening on Earth today, right? The authorities have told us as much. To hear some tell it, the late Dr. Jacob Bronowski, for one, the story of human evolution is one of almost unbroken ascent from the darkness of the Stone Age to the so-called Enlightenment of our present age. Certainly there have been setbacks, wars, plagues, dark ages and the like, but we've continued on, relentlessly moving up the ladder, and just a few thousand years after cowering in the caves, here we stand, masters of nature, technology, and all that we survey, alone at the top. Or so we have been led to believe.
In Egypt near Cairo, towering over the Giza plateau, stands what the Encyclopedia Britannica calls the greatest single building ever erected by mankind. Taller than a 40-story skyscraper, it is, according to the encyclopedia, a masterpiece of technical skill and engineering, containing approximately 2,300,000 blocks of stone, weighing an average of 2.5 tons each. Many weigh much more than that. All this, we are told, was accomplished without wheels, pulleys, or block and tackle. Moreover, often forgotten is the fact that the entire surface of the pyramid was once covered with 16-ton limestone blocks, polished to the tolerances of a contact lens, and fitted together so tightly that a sharp knife could not penetrate the joints. An achievement far beyond the capability of any Bronze Age implements that we know of, if not today's high-tech tools. In Peru, near Lake Titicaca, the Cayce temple has been dated by astronomical methods to almost 17,000 years BC. Its massive stone blocks are held tightly together by bronze staples poured from some kind of portable smelter many millennia before the so-called Bronze Age. At the nearby Akapana pyramid, stone blocks at the base are still so tightly fitted that a 50th of an inch thick playing card cannot be inserted between them. While at Pumapunku, work stone blocks lie about which weigh in excess of 100 tons. Throughout the world, and especially in the British Isles, giant standing stones and other ancient monuments are precisely aligned along perfectly straight tracks for many hundreds of miles. The existence of this vast network of what are called ley lines suggests at a minimum the high development of mathematical and surveying skills. And just as mysterious are the stones themselves, which it is said were moved into place on primitive wooden rollers. The blue stones at Stonehenge, for instance, were brought over 150 miles from Wales and lined up with a precision which at the least allowed the site to serve as an astronomical observatory. Boston University astronomer and mathematician Gerald Hawkins is among those who have demonstrated that Stonehenge could, with astounding exactitude, predict both lunar and solar eclipses. But even if we concede Stonehenge to conventional Stone Age construction theories, what about the Grand Menhir Brise of Lac Méricourt in Brittany, northern France? Once more than half a football field tall, it has been felled by some earthquake or other natural disaster and broken into 4 pieces. When standing, it weighed 340 tons, more than double the lifting capacity of today's largest commercial construction cranes. When standing, the Grand Menhir could also be used to predict lunar eclipses. How high did the sciences of the ancients once rise? And what could we learn from them today?
We're standing right now in the ruins of Old Sarum Castle, just a short distance over that way. The Salisbury Cathedral, a short distance that way, Stonehenge. All 3 are on a perfectly straight line, an ancient Lee line.
Though Salisbury Cathedral was built in the 13th century, the site on which it is located is really much older, serving some kind of ancient ceremonial function for perhaps thousands of years before construction of the cathedral. The same is true for many churches throughout England. When the Christians arrived, they recognized the high esteem in which certain locations were held by the locals, appropriated them for their own purposes, and thus permanently marked such spots for posterity. In the 17th century, observers of the English landscape, primarily William Stukely and John Aubrey, noted that many ancient sites appeared to be aligned along straight tracks of considerable length. 2 centuries later, Alfred Watkins, a Herefordshire businessman and amateur photographer, discovered what he called the Lee system, a vast grid of perfectly straight lines uniting all of England's ancient sites. British author and Cambridge-trained scholar John Michell has investigated the Lee system and other ancient lore and now argues that not only in England but across much of the earth are ancient earthworks and stone monuments built for an unknown purpose whose shared features suggest that they are part of a worldwide system which served the high elemental science of a civilization now lost to history.
Caesar says himself that the Druids knew the size and shape of the earth and talked about those matters. But I've got examples of, say, island territories where you can tell the boundaries, because they're defined by nature, where the surveyed centre is actually on the main axis of that island, the very centre, not an inch off. So all the roads, all the old tracks lead to here.
They converge.
Yeah, and they're very old too. Mm-hmm. And it's right from, the main axis goes from East Anglia along something called the Icknield Way, a prehistoric path that falls on the whole axis, which goes right to the west, extreme west of Cornwall. And all along it there's shrines, and sometimes evidence of tracks, and then other trackways converge upon this place. So it's much older, actually, than these stones as a sanctuary.
While the exact purpose of the Lee arrangement may be unclear, that does not mean it had no purpose. Some think it might have served to guide souls after death. Others believe it might have been some kind of power grid, harnessing subtle earth currents in some useful way which we have long since forgotten. For John Michell and his kindred researchers, the lost ancient order is envisioned as vast and complex, to a degree which is difficult to grasp today. The suggestion is that we are literally surrounded by the ruins of its legacy. But like bats in a haunted house, we have failed to comprehend the design and purpose of the great structure in which we find ourselves. Only when we rise above the stereotypes of a more primitive way of thinking do we behold the grander landscape and discover where the rotting building timbers lie buried. The ley-line structure investigated by Michell, and before him by William Stukeley, John Aubrey, Alfred Watkins, and others, implies nothing so much as the presence of a vast but coherent prehistoric order or civilization whose existence is difficult to deny.
I would speculate that there was a very high evolved civilization running around 10,500 BC, still active, and somehow was perhaps eradicated by a catastrophic event, and remnants of this civilization and its knowledge found itself in Egypt.
Robert Bauval is an engineer and an astronomer who has produced extensive evidence that the ancient Egyptians were attempting to build on Earth a subtle and mysterious reflection of patterns in the stars, especially the constellation Orion. He finds their technology equally mysterious.
One of the questions that is rarely asked is why did they use such large-sized blocks to construct temples? There is a very annoying question that is rarely asked, because you can build temples. In fact, you should build temples with much smaller blocks. So that is the problem. We seem to see people who, for reasons that are inexplicable, made their work process extremely difficult and took it to a point where conventional explanation do not fit. So researchers who are bold in exploring this need to break through this convention and say, well, they must have had a technology. They must have had a technology that fitted.
I believe there's evidence that civilization on this planet goes back many, many thousands of years, even hundreds of thousands of years.
David Hatcher Childress has personally investigated the remnants of lost civilizations in many parts of the world and has written numerous books on his findings.
There's a number of unusual artifacts that are found, and more importantly, there is the evidence that comes from the ancient traditions, including ancient histories and texts, which also indicate that civilization has gone back many, many tens of thousands of years, and not just the 6,000 to 7,000 to 8,000 years that mainstream archaeologists say that civilization is going back.
There is no doubt whatever that civilization is far, far older than we ever thought.
Prolific writer on the paranormal and unexplained anomalies, Colin Wilson has been fascinated by the mysterious capabilities of lost ancient civilizations for many years.
It's impossible that Egyptian civilization could reach that point of sophistication in such a short time. You see, it's supposed to have started around about 3000 BC. This is when the legendary King Menes, the first Egyptian king, is supposed to have appeared. Before that, there were supposed to have been Bedouins on horseback and nothing else in Egypt. And then quite suddenly, a mere 4 centuries later, you get the Great Pyramids and the Sphinx. Well, it's preposterous.
I mean, essentially, to me, they're saying that, well, history is a straight line graph where we have caveman down here at the bottom, and then up at the top of the graph, there's modern man. I maintain, and others do, of course, as well, that history is this roller coaster of ups and downs, and these peaks and valleys in this roller coaster have been going on for tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, and not just the last few thousand years.
What seems to be the case is that a very quick upsurge of such construction technology is not, there is no evidence of a build-up towards it, or at least the period that is involved between the construction of earlier pyramids and Giza is very, very short to allocate a progression. It seems that there is a knowledge, a technology that came from outside, that was already available and was imported or came and was brought into Egypt. Where it came from, I would not venture to suggest, but there's been many suggestions of a earlier civilization.
The old slave ramp roller theory is little more than pablum spooned up and fed to children. It's like a Grimm's fairy tale.
Best-selling author Richard Noon has made the case for advanced ancient achievement a personal crusade for over 20 years.
I believe, and I have a massive amount of data in the book that supports the theory that the Great Pyramid was built by survivors of a technologically advanced civilization that entered into Egypt and chose this one single spot where the Great Pyramid sits. It's at the exact center of the planet's landmass, and I believe that it was built by survivors of a technologically advanced civilization, and they incorporated in the structure all the knowledge of their science, and they built it so that it would survive practically any disaster on Earth, and it patiently sat there for thousands and thousands and thousands of years until man reobtained a state of knowledge where he could begin to see that there was something extraordinary about this massive structure.
The orthodox version of the origins of the Great Pyramid is made clear in this 1950s film prepared by the academic establishment to teach the public just what the ancient builders supposedly could and could not do.
On the plateau of Giza, we find the full flowering of pyramid tomb construction. And the mightiest of all, the Great Pyramid of Cheops, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Here, great blocks of stone were used, weighing several tons each. Stones which could not be raised by muscle power alone. The engineering principles of ramps, rollers, and levers were employed in this stupendous architectural feat.
Stupendous indeed. Yet, despite overwhelming evidence for the magnitude of the accomplishment, accepted theory among today's most influential Egyptologists remains unchanged. The Great Pyramid was nothing more than a large tomb constructed by slaves working with primitive tools, mud ramps, and rollers.
I think the mainstream establishment finds it difficult to look at the world in a different way than they have. And this is very much the story of ancient technology and particularly advanced ancient civilizations. It's a way of looking at the past differently than our high school teachers or TV has taught us how to do.
The modern scientific establishment is only now being dragged, kicking and screaming, to the table.
Mainly because of the media, combination of the media and the internet, it's now impossible for the opposition. They don't own the show anymore. They own the mainstream media. The mainstream media is still basically newspapers and so on, perfectly tame and parrots the stupidities of the Egyptologists and the archaeologists as though they were gospel truths. But we now have the internet and television, which actually has a huge advantage. Television catches a lot of flack because it is quite, I mean, it's in one sense quite rightly, it is absolutely amoral. I mean, television doesn't give a damn about whether things are right or wrong as long as they make money. So as soon as they get ideas such as some of these of ours, which are glamorous, they also happen to be right. Television doesn't care if they're right or wrong. As long as people are going to watch, they'll put it on there. So it becomes possible, actually, to present right ideas, even responsibly, present them even responsibly to enormous audiences, whether the establishment likes it or not. So, in fact, you get the establishment kicking and screaming at the hardcore Nazi edge of science, where you have the skeptic, the sort of the savages of the skeptical inquirer. You find them actually trying to campaign to force television not to air this kind of material, which is an indication of how very frightened they are, and for good reason. So we probably don't have to wait for all of us to die for these ideas for these valid ideas or for the ideas, let's say, to prove themselves valid and to then get accepted in due course.
When the conflict between orthodox and unorthodox is so sharp, where does one go for truly authoritative answers? We decided to go where any modern real estate developer with much at stake would go, to the experts of the engineering and building professions. James Hagan is designer and builder of some of the most outstanding architecture in the world today. Among his creations are the Walt Disney World Shopping Center near Kissimmee, Florida, the Federated Department Store building in Cincinnati, Ohio, and MARTA, Atlanta's gigantic state-of-the-art subway system. When it comes to computing the logistics and engineering requirements of a major construction project, where most Egyptologists must be considered mere amateurs, Hagan is an expert.
That's all stainless steel skylight, all set within that segmented drum, precast, post-tension. Each one of those slices was brought to the side independently, fastened together, strung together in post-tension with stainless steel cables, series of cables. Heavy engineering. I can't tell you how much engineering, how much design work went in to fabricating each one of these pieces. If you try to transfer that to the dialogue that must have taken place at the construction of the Giza pyramid, it's impossible to do it in a rudimentary way. Our design statement for this was to build something that would last 100 years. We selected the granite, and the brick, and the marble, and the precast, the man-cast stone. You can see each one. You can see how large each one of those stones is, and that's smaller than what would be in a pyramid.
When we talk about the Great Pyramid at Giza, I would have to say it's impossible to build by modern devices, and therefore impossible by any primitive methods. When we go back to the earliest known architectural vocabulary of ancient Egypt, they deal with small pieces, relatively small columns, and small masonry units. The pyramid is different than that. It has none of those pieces. It has no small repetitive pieces. These are very large, very complex pieces to even conceptualize, much less translate that into something that is quarried by a primitive society with limited tools. The things I'm concerned about are the elements of the construction and how they came to be. That's what I have to deal with in my world, and those are the principles that I'm trying to apply to this building. The placing of the stones would be impossible by today's standards. We have no cranes, no mechanical devices that are up to the task. We could not place them with the precision where we find them. The alignment, buildings today are simply not situated that perfectly on their site. We don't even try for that degree of accuracy in buildings today. There's really no reason to do it. So to try to determine, well, what was the reason and why did they try to accomplish it is the first mystery. I can tell you that these Egyptians or whoever it was that built the pyramid, they could build anything they wanted to.
Robert Boval, an engineer himself, sees similar challenges for the builders of the Valley Temple near the Sphinx.
The difficulties is, for example, the number of men that you need to move these size of blocks. A very quick calculation shows that taking the friction of the soil and the maximum angle of ramp to move a 150-ton block, you would need in the region of about 800 men towing at the same time at precisely the same traction force. Now, assuming that you would have 4 rows of men with a distance of approximately 1.5 meters away, you're talking about lengths that far exceed the size of the temple. They would actually have to fall on the other side of the temple. We cannot see how that type of ramp methods could work. So we have to consider that there may have been some other technology.
For every mysterious megalithic site, there is a standard set of conventional primitive scenarios, most of which have never been subjected to a rigorous engineering analysis. A professional toolmaker and engineer, Christopher Dunn, has subjected many ancient Egyptian artifacts to state-of-the-art laboratory testing.
When I was in Egypt in 1986, I was absolutely astounded by some of the artifacts that I saw in the Cairo Museum and also the Great Pyramid itself and around the Great Pyramid. Specifically, I was looking at some of the granite stones that were broken off the second pyramid and the sharpness of the corners, the flatness of the surfaces. So when I went back to Egypt in 1995, I took some tools with me, some instruments with which I could check the precision of these artifacts. I had in front of me an artifact that had a contour and it showed that it was actually, it must have been cut using some mechanical device that traveled or guided a tool in 3 axes, because the tool marks and the contour of the artifact itself created a contour that was repeatable across a length of about 29 inches. Also, the tool that cut this contour, when it came to a corner, it left a radius, and that radius was consistent around the entire block. But I wanted to measure it against what I knew to be a true radius, and so I measured it against just a standard gauge that you would find in a machine shop, which is a radius gauge. But you can see that that is actually a true radius. You bring it away from the radius and you see the light disappearing, or you see the light appear and then you bring it into the radius and the light disappears. And so what we had on that particular block was a true radius that went completely around the corner blend. Evidence of machining, clear evidence of machining. It was repeatable and precise.
There are fine grooves that one sees cut in this kind of work, but the reproduction itself is a duplication that would require a template, a machine template to reproduce it. And that is what Chris brought out. The other thing is planing. He convinced me, at least at one stage, that the kind of planing of stone, such as granite, would require machine planing to the precision that some of the blocks have been found. For example, some of the granite blocks in the Great Pyramid, and more precisely, we examined together some sarcophagi in the Serapeum, where the planing is almost so smooth, flat, almost like a mirror, within the kind of precision that one wouldn't expect by hand planing. So that's the kind of thing that began to convince me of something, of a greater technology than mere hand technology.
The inside of the sarcophagus in Khafre's pyramid is extremely precise. I used the precision ground parallel on the surface on the inside of the sarcophagus and found it to be so flat that you could not see light pass through the interface where the metal actually met the granite. Sliding that parallel along the surface was like sliding a gauge along a precision ground surface plate that you would use in a tool shop. Regardless of where you moved this parallel, whether you moved it horizontally or vertically, up and down. It was so precise. I was absolutely amazed. I exclaimed, space-age precision. And it's not just the tools for cutting. Even if you would accept that they were able to machine this, or to actually cut this using sand and using bone, or using other rocks and bashing it, or using copper chisels, even if we were to accept that, to be able to create these artifacts and create these perfectly flat surfaces and repeat the precision over a large area would require other instruments, metrology instruments, because these were not done coincidental. They were done intentionally. They had to be intentional. So it would have required other metrology equipment.
Not content with simply saying that Egyptologists are wrong about the capabilities of the ancient builders, Dunn makes the astonishing assertion that the ancient Egyptians used at the least high-speed drills and even ultrasound.
As I was reading William Flinders Petrie's book on the pyramids and temples of Giza, one of the artifacts that he was describing was a core that was taken out of a hole drilled into granite. Some of these cores were up to 4 inches in diameter. The feed rate, which was what puzzled Petrie so much, for every revolution that the drill turned, it sunk into the granite 1/10 of an inch. The feed rate could be an indication of the method that they used to advance the tool into the workpiece. And with ultrasonic machining, it is a totally, it's a different than conventional methods of machining. Essentially what you have is a vibrating tool bit, and the tool actually cuts through vibration, and an abrasive slurry would be fed into the workpiece to assist and accelerate the cutting action. So this is fairly strong evidence that the ancient Egyptians were using ultrasonics to drill. I have yet to have anybody come forward with a conventional means or a primitive means to actually reproduce these artifacts.
The work that Chris Dunn is doing, proving, as far as I'm concerned, proving that very sophisticated machinery of some sort was used to cut and polish those stones is, I think, extremely compelling. And I mean, the evidence comes from where evidence is supposed to come from somebody who actually cuts stone himself and who works with machines. Egyptologists and archaeologists do not cut stone and do not work with machines, and their opinions in such matter, as with the weathering patterns on rock, are basically of no particular value. Their PhDs in Egyptology does not give them any expertise whatever in the machining of very hard rocks that we can't machine today.
When you look at the precision, the high precision of these artifacts and the photographs and the evidence that I have collected while I was in Egypt, it's still there, and people can still go over and they can still look at this material, they can take measurements, and then they can look at the evidence and say, yes, there's no way this could be done by primitive society. We have to revise the theory.
Inventor Patrick Flanagan is best known for his book on pyramid power. He believes the ancients possessed an insight into the capabilities of the pyramidal form itself, which is only beginning to be rediscovered today.
In my research, I further established, for example, that if you were designing a pyramid microwave horn, the impedance of free space is about 377 ohms. This is well known. And in a pyramid, if you change the angle of the pyramid, what you find out is that the impedance, the matching impedance, will change. This is well known in electronics. And basically, by if you take the geometry of the Great Pyramid, the impedance at the apex is 377 ohms, which is the impedance of free space, which means that it's a perfect resonator matching the impedance of free space. So there are many possibilities that the pyramid can resonate not only known radio frequency type energies, but also other possible energies, for example, scalar signals. We now know that we have a lot of scalar energy fields, zero-point energy, for example, and that the pyramid could be resonating because it is resonant to the impedance of free space.
They used a chemical engine at the heart of the building site to build the building up from the middle and outward.
Richard Noon believes the Great Pyramid was built using hydraulic techniques.
The technology used was not rediscovered until a man by the name of Edward Kunkel, who I tell his story in my book, spent 30 years of his life, up until the time he was 80-something years old, deciphering how the building of the Great Pyramid took place by an ingenious use of water, applied physics, compounded atmospheric and gravitational pressure, and an ingenious use of vacuums where water was used as the lifting medium. With this hydraulic system of engineering, you can lift 70-ton stones up, move them, set them gently in place with no handling scars.
Colin Wilson believes the advanced capabilities of the ancients are best understood in terms of highly developed psi powers, which are now latent.
These peculiar powers, I'm sure the Egyptians didn't know they were performing magic. They did these things probably under the guidance of a priest. They did them all together singing as they did it. They heaved these great 6-ton blocks into position, or in the case of the Sphinx temple, 200-ton blocks. They thought the god did it or whatever, and suddenly the block was in place. When we do these things in this strange state of sheer happiness, I'm sure, you know, everything works.
Writer David Hatcher Childress believes that every technology known to man was as familiar to the ancients as it is to us.
However, according to many of the ancient sources, including legends, there is evidence that such things as levitation and kind of sonic or sound technology has been used in levitating stones. Similarly, we know that the ancient Romans and the Mayans used concrete and cement quite a great deal, much the same way we did today. And similarly, I mean, there's evidence that some ancient structures have actually been molded into place and are a very sophisticated form of concrete. So I think we have a combination of different building techniques, which include everything from pouring concrete, much like we do today, to even levitating stones with sound and other high-tech devices, to even just simply moving massive stones by truck or train or by crane.
But if the ancients possessed such advanced knowledge, the question remains, when, where, and from whom did they get it? For Zecharia Sitchin, there is no mystery regarding how the ancients came by their advanced knowledge. The leading scholar of the Ancient Astronaut School of History, Sitchin uses his formidable knowledge of Sumerian cuneiform and other ancient texts to argue that all human achievement is a legacy from extraterrestrials.
In order to understand the so-called ancient myths, which I take as factual records, one has to factor into the ancient past of our planet and of mankind. the acceptance as a reality that people from another planet, much more advanced than us, had come to Earth starting about 450,000 years ago, coming and going between Earth, our planet, and their planet, which was called Nibiru, every 3,600 years. And every 3,600 years, when they found mankind worthy of more knowledge, of more technology, more science, more advancement, they gave it to us. And that was the basic premise of all the ancient writings.
Since it's not my direct experience, I want to see some evidence. So that, when you extrapolate out of that and say, well, were these ancient civilizations terrestrial or extraterrestrial? Well, that just simply magnifies the problem of origins exponentially. We don't know. The problem of documenting extraterrestrial life is itself is another big, huge problem. And when you put those two big, huge problems together, you get a huge problem squared or cubed. And it's simply an unanswered.
You don't have to believe in ancient astronauts, however, to explain the source of ancient wisdom.
There is a certain amount of documentation. The Egyptians themselves, for example, talk about they say in their texts quite openly that that their own civilization extends many, many thousands of years further back than the time of the pharaohs. This is simply discounted by archaeologists and Egyptologists. But when you look at the figures that the Egyptians give, which unfortunately are not in very close agreement with each other, but they're talking in the neighborhood of 25, 35, 40,000 years, and oddly enough, the Vedic texts also talk about origins of civilization, and they're also giving a period of around 40,000 years or so. So actually, this still earlier cycle is not, it shouldn't be dismissed as nonsense piled upon nonsense.
This technology was known in the ancient land of Atlantis and Lemuria, and that at that time we applied those powers to shape the pyramids as a record to us of a long forgotten time when we were wiser and more closely connected to the creative forces. But we're evolving back to that now. In fact, we're fast approaching an era in which we'll regain that wisdom.
Author and researcher John Van Auken is executive director for ARE, the Association for Research and Enlightenment in Virginia Beach, Virginia. Established to pursue the work of Edgar Cayce, ARE preserves in its library transcripts for thousands of clairvoyant Cayce readings given in the first quarter of this century, dealing with everything from health to Atlantis. The material, where testing is possible, has proven uncannily accurate. Today, researchers carefully comb his words for clues to many mysteries, including the scope of ancient achievement.
According to Edgar Cayce, much of the sophisticated technology we see represented on the Giza plateau was actually because we were more sophisticated consciously in ancient times. I know right now we hold to the theory that everything old is primitive, and that only the more modern things are more sophisticated and wiser. But the truth is, there was a time prior to this evolution in which we were highly sophisticated and could use the forces of nature and of the universe to actually affect matter and material.
Edgar Evans Cayce, the youngest son of Virginia Beach's famous sleeping prophet, has recently collaborated with his daughter, Gail Cayce Swartzer, and writer Douglas Richards in the re-release of their book on the Edgar Cayce readings on Atlantis.
According to Cayce, it was at least as advanced, or maybe more so than ours. He talks about in the past, in the very distant past, 50, 30,000 years ago, of flying machines, and talks about technology that sounded like gene research. It sounded like development of lasers or masers or atomic power. He talked about things that were very highly, very scientific, especially when you consider these readings, some of them were given in the 20s and 30s, and some of the technology hadn't been developed yet.
I mean, what they talk about that crystal being able to drive, to actually do what you drive things through air, underwater, it was like it was the central force for everything. I mean, you didn't need gas companies or whatever. It all happened through that somehow. Now how, I don't know.
What the Cayce readings talk about, of course, is some rather high technology in Atlantis. But the interesting thing about the technology is that many of the readings that were given about the technology, there are actually only a few, were given for the same person, a man whose reading number is 440, who was an engineer. And he was interested in all kinds of technological things, and so he's got readings on building radionics machines, on the Great Atlantean Crystal, and this sort of thing. And so a lot of people are surprised. They expect there are many Cayce readings on Atlantean technology, whereas the more you search the readings, the more you keep hitting against Mr. 440's readings. And those are quite interesting. Cayce encouraged him to work on developing technology, and also put in some strong warnings, because he said that he was one of the people involved when they tuned the crystal too high and destroyed Atlantis. So the readings combined this encouragement in working with technology and warnings that he'd better be a little more spiritual this time around.
What he said was that some of this technology would be discovered in the next 25 years. Well, almost exactly 25 years to the date after that reading, there were two things that were discovered that might relate to what he was talking about. One of them was the discovery of the antimatter. And of course, the combination of antimatter with ordinary matter would be the complete obliteration of all the matter into energy, and it would be a much greater explosion than an atomic or hydrogen bomb. Another thing that happened almost exactly 25 years later was the development at Bell Labs of the first maser.
Writer Tom Kay is a lifelong student of the Edgar Cayce readings.
Atlantis destroyed itself. It just literally brought itself down because of the misuse of its technology. And it eventually, I guess, just the powers to be, or the energy that it misused, eventually destroyed the country.
Cayce is not the only source for information on Atlantis. Among others, Helene Petrovna Blavatsky, an intuitive and founder of the Theosophical Society, wrote voluminously about Atlantis and its history. The source most trusted by scholars, though, is the Greek philosopher Plato, whose vivid description of an advanced island civilization in the middle of the great ocean beyond the Pillars of Hercules haunts us still. And while it is true that no one has produced tangible physical evidence which can be certified as from Atlantis, there are some who would say that advanced knowledge among ancient people is itself an artifact of Atlantis. Anyway, all disputes in the matter may soon be over. That at least is the view of Cayce true believers. According to Cayce and others, the Atlanteans left behind a hall of records which fully explains their history and their achievements.
Well, the nearest thing he said to where they might be was that there was a passageway to this chamber or pyramid that these records are in, from the right forepaw of the Sphinx. And evidently it was, according to him, it was in front of the Sphinx somewhere. Until somebody finds that, we won't know if he was right or not. Of course, he said that Atlantis wasn't destroyed in one day, as Plato said, but over a period of time, and that the inhabitants went both east and west, and that they carried some of their history with them. And some of them went into Egypt and Spain and Portugal. Some of them went into South and Central America. And that there were records in Central America somewhere. There were records in Egypt.
My expectations from everything that has been suggested in ancient legends, in ancient texts, is that we may find records, may find writings. If there's anything, now what would be certainly very interesting is that something was concealed that required to be preserved other than written documents, something of material importance. It's certainly be very exciting if there is something that shouldn't be there, that we discover, like a piece of steel, for example, or some manufactured material that could not have been manufactured at that time.
Throughout history, knowledge has been destroyed. Not only has the great library at Alexandria been totally destroyed in the 4th century AD, but the Emperor Qi Huangdi of China, who built the Great Wall, he also ordered every book destroyed in China in 500 BC. Certain times, Sir Aurel Stein in 1910 discovered an ancient library in the Gobi Desert, which had been walled up in some ancient Buddhist caves. I mean, we know that these secret libraries do exist. And certainly, these ancient libraries existed as well, with hundreds of thousands of books on history and what happened in the world before, and books on technology as well. A number of archaeologists are actively searching the entire world for these halls of records. I do believe that many of them will be found in the near future.
I am very excited about these times. Every week we hear of a new discovery. Every week there's something new occurring. It's like time has sped up and everything's revealing itself very quickly. I think we're going to see over the next 20 years the greatest discoveries ever seen on this planet.
If, as Van Auken and others believe, a new era of discovery is dawning, it's possible we may soon behold the gods of antiquity for who they truly were, our magnificent predecessors. Maybe then we will understand at last the lessons they have to teach us.
Could an ancient civilization have risen to heights similar to our own and perhaps have traveled a different road? What would we understand of a world which might have employed fundamentally different, though no less effective techniques to harness the forces of nature? Would we understand a world which could, for example, achieve and transmit energy by means other than a power grid? Are we capable of recognizing achievement along different lines than our own? Or would we resort to the convenient pigeonholes provided by theories of mumbo-jumbo and mysterious religious practice? The Church of the Middle Ages underscored its own authority by insisting that Earth was the center of the solar system, and burned at the stake those who differed, no matter what the evidence might show to the contrary. Could today's reigning conception of the limits of prehistoric society be but another in the long line of self-serving conceits to which our race is heir?
Much as I delight in sort of tweaking the noses of the academic establishment, in fact, it's rather more violent than that. I like doing a lot more damage than that. But much as I enjoy that, that's not the objective of the exercise. In the past, people had an idea of, a very good idea, or knowledge even, understanding, wisdom, that we are on this earth for a very real purpose, and that civilization can only occur when we are trying to achieve that purpose. And so the ancient civilizations stand as models for understanding that ancient wisdom.